The truth is that even before we leave, everybody will say one kapitel Tillim, because this is really the saddest place that we're coming to today. The saddest place by far is this Beis Olam where Rabbeinu Yaakov Yosef is buried. Many people feel that his name was Yosef, Joseph, that was his last name. Although when you look at the kever, it looks like that was his regular name, Yaakov Yosef, and it doesn't say anything what his last name was. But most people understand that that was his last name, Joseph. He was born in 1840. He was nifter in 1902, a broken, sad man. He lived to be only 62. He learned in a klois by Rav Yisrael Salanter. Eventually he learned in the great yeshiva of Volozhin, and his Rebbe was the Netziv. He was known in Slobodka as Yankel Acharif. Charif means a very sharp person. He was a brilliant, brilliant Talmud Chacham and a wonderful person. As he got older, the Orthodox communities in New York were not really as organized as they wanted to be, and there were 8 main shuls, and they were under the Beis Medrash. It was called the Beis Medrash HaGadol, and they wanted a Rav HaKoilel. Koilel means it includes everyone. Koilel, that's what it means, to include everyone. And they wanted to have a chief rabbi who would be the Rav of New York. He would be considered the Rav HaRashi of New York, and he would be considered the Rav HaKoilel, the Rav of all the 8 shuls. And there were many, many candidates. This position was considered so prominent. Let me tell you some of the candidates that they were considering. One was Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan himself. Another was Reb Chaim Berlin. The other was Rabbi Shua Leib Diskin. Could you imagine? That's what they were considering. And another one was Rabbi Azriel Hildesheimer. And finally, the one that they chose was the Malbim. The famous Malbim that we all learn his Perish on Chumash and Tanakh. He was chosen, and he was offered to become the Rav, but Nebuch, he passed away before he was able to come to be the Rav in New York. And now, the question was they had to find somebody else. So Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan and the Beis HaLevi and Rabbi Elia Chaim Meisels, they all went to Rabbi Yaakov Yosef and they told him, you're the man. You're the one who will be able to organize all the shuls, and everybody will follow you because you're a Paisek. He was a Magid, he was a Dayan, he was brilliant, and he was a great speaker, and everybody liked him. Now he was hesitant to come to New York because he was afraid for his children. In those days, New York was not what it is today. And he said, look, even in Europe, children are going off to derech. What in the world is going to happen in New York? But unfortunately, he was a tremendous Bal Chayv. He owed a tremendous amount of money. And because he owed so much money, and they offered him money here, he figured that he would come. And so he came in 1888. He left his family back home in the beginning because he figured that he will pay off the debts, and then he'll be able to bring his family, or maybe he'll go back. But the moment he came here, that was the beginning of the end. He had many, many opponents. In those days, the butchers and the people that were not from had a tremendous koyach, especially those Yiddish-speaking newspapers. In those days, many of the Yiddish-speaking newspapers were not from, and they wrote against him, and they spread rumors against him. And the butchers, they controlled the meat and the kosher business, and they were very, very unscrupulous. And what they did was, they started saying terrible things about him. He saw that the shachtim were not erlach. He wanted to bring shachtim from Europe, and all them that raised the price of meat, obviously. He wanted to bring erlach mashgichim, because he felt the mashgichim they had here were not proper, and it raised again the price of meat. And the butchers went crazy, and they actually appointed a man, Rabbi Yeshua Siegel, and he announced himself as the chief Rav. Here they brought Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, and he's trying to raise the level of kashrus, and then they undermined him, and they appoint another chief Rav, and it was very, very embarrassing and very painful to him. What happened was he started the first yeshiva. The first yeshiva in New York was in 1886. It was the Yeshivas Eitz Chaim, and that eventually became the Yeshiva Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan. he started hashgacha on flour for matzah, and that raised the price of matzah by 1/4 penny for a matzah, but still they criticized him and they gave his life, they made him very miserable. Eventually he left the position and he was a mashgiach in a butcher shop, and even that they took away from him. And now Nebuch in 1897, he had a terrible stroke at 57, age of 57, and he suffered until he passed away at the age of 62. His final Shabbos Shuvah Drasha was so sad. There's a book that just came out about him, and it describes that Shabbos Shuvah Drasha. He got up to say a Rambam in Hilchas Tshuva. Now, he started quoting it, and he forgot it, and he couldn't quote it, and he started crying. He said, I can't believe I'm quoting a Rambam in Hilchas Tshuva, and I don't remember it. There was a time when I knew all of Shas. I could quote every Gemara in Shas, and now I can't even quote a Rambam in Hilchas Tshuva. And he started crying, and everybody cried with him, because they knew that he wasn't only crying about forgetting the Rambam. They knew at his bitter life that was going to end soon. And he said, Guck, was wird von a Mensch. Look what happens to a person. A person could be such a baki. A person could be such a Talmud Chacham, but he gets old, and we all know people, Nebuch, who have dementia, and people who lose it, and it's so sad. And here this was a public display of Nebuch, the sadness that was happening in his life. When he died, there was a great machlokes where he should be buried. And it was this cemetery over here that paid a fortune that he should be buried, because they figured if the chief rabbi of New York, who was really, everybody knew that he was Erlach, that he would be buried here, other people would want to come to be buried not far from him. At his Levaya, there were 50,000 people. 50,000 people is an unbelievable amount even today. And why did people come? Because they knew they did him wrong. They knew they didn't stand up for him. They knew they didn't defend him. And everybody felt guilty. Listen to what happened at his Levaya. It's unbelievable. And everybody said that Hashem was paying back those people. It started, the Levaya started in the Lower East Side and was going to come over the Williamsburg Bridge to come then to Williamsburg. And they were going to take a ferry from the Lower East Side to come to Williamsburg. Part of the place that the Levaya was going was underneath a huge building for the time that was owned by the R.H.R. Ho and Company. R. Ho and Company was a German printing company. They hated Jews even in those years. And as the Yidden started walking with this mob scene, carrying the coffin of Rabbeinu Yaakov Yosef, they started throwing bottles from the roof of that building. And they started throwing pieces of iron from the printing press. Now all of a sudden this stuff is raining down on Yidden, and this pandemonium breaks out. Everybody's running and screaming, and people are falling over each other. And then there were Yidden who went upstairs to fight with those Goyim. So Yidden were beaten up upstairs. The cops came. The cops blamed the Yidden for starting a riot. And it was just terrible. Yidden were hurt downstairs. Yidden were hurt upstairs. It was just an absolute disaster. And people wrote about it. Again, as I say, there's a new book that just came out about Rabbeinu Yaakov Yosef. You could see in the New York Times, and you could see in all the papers, the writing of what happened, the turmoil that happened on that day. Nebuch, so many people were hurt, and people said that the Yidden were hurt because they didn't give kavod to Rabbeinu Yaakov Yosef. But Hashem remembers, just like we said before. And 2 years later, almost to the day of that Levaya, the H. Rowe Company took out their people on a boat, on a cruise. There were many, many workers. And that cruise boat hit something and it sank, and so many of those workers drowned and they were killed. In other words, the Yidden may have deserved that punishment, but no Goy has the right to be the Shliach. And that's what people say about Hitler. If for whatever reason Hashem wanted it to happen, but why did he have that Misa Meshuda? And why will the Germans be punished at the end? Because they chose to be the Shliach. And H. Rowe Company, they chose to be the Shliach of hurting Yidden, and eventually they were punished. It's very sad to be here. It's very sad to know that Rabbi Yaakov Yosef had a difficult life. But lately, because of the book that came out, and lately because people like Morty Melman and others have brought people to the Kivrei Tzadikim, he's getting the recognition, late, but he's getting the recognition. There are thousands of people who come, especially Chassidish people come on the day of his yurtzeit, and they come to be mispalel. And so therefore I think that over here we should also be mispalel. But I want to end with a story that's very upbeat, a story that's very positive, because you can't leave. The Gemara says you can't leave on a low key. Usually also when a pasuk ends on a sad note, we don't end with that pasuk. So I want to end with a pasuk that shows the beauty of Klal Yisrael, and then Rav Shlomi Dax will sing like nobody else can sing. We'll sing Achenu Beis Yisrael, and we'll sing, and we know that we're here together on a great day of davening for each other and a great day of Schusim. Some of you may have heard this story already. This is a story that took place in Eretz Yisrael just a few years ago. There's a place that's called Yad Eliezer. Yad Eliezer is a wonderful organization, and they help many people that are challenged financially. And there's a fellow by the name of Mr. Wolf, and he donated a wedding hall, and it's called the Wolf Hall, and it's in Yerushalayim. And they have two auditoriums where they make chasanas, Ulam Aleph and Ulam Beis. And what happened was that everybody likes to go to Ulam Aleph because it's a little bigger and it's a little nicer. So the Goldberg family called 2 years ago, and they wanted to have a wedding, and they wanted it in Ulam Aleph, and the caterer told me that he said, you got to come and sign right away, because everybody wants Ulam Aleph, and we make 2 weddings here every night. So they signed that afternoon. 2 months later, the Silverberg family calls. They also want to make a wedding in Wolf Hall. They also want Ulam Aleph. And he says, I'm sorry, we signed already with the Goldbergs. So the Silverbergs had no choice, and they signed in Ulam Beis. And then what happens is, a few weeks later, the Kala, the Silverberg Kala, calls the Goldberg Kala. And she says, you know, I know you guys signed first, and you really deserve to have Ulam Aleph. But we have people coming from America, and we have so many people. Is there any way that you would be maskim, or is there any way that you would be maskim that we should be able to have Ulam Aleph? She says, I can't make that decision. I have to ask my parents. And she goes to her parents, and the parents say, of course not. We signed early because we also have a lot of people coming. We need it for ourselves. Weeks go by, months go by, the invitations are out. And now it's Parshas Vayetze. And in Parshas Vayetze, the Goldberg Kala is sitting in shul, and she's listening to Kriyas HaTorah. And she hears how Rachel gave over the Simonim to Leah. And Parshas Vayetze, Rachel was the one who was supposed to marry Yaakov. But because Lavan made the shtick, Leah was going to be very embarrassed. So Rachel was Mavater, and she gave in, and she gave the Simonim to her sister Leah. And as she's listening to Kriyas HaTorah, the Goldberg Kala decides, I have to be like the Mama Rachel. The Mama Rachel was a Mavater, she gave in, I'm also going to give in. I'm going to give in, and I'm going to give the wedding hall to the Silverbergs, and I'll be in Ulam Beis. She goes home after davening, she says to her parents, listen, I decided I want to give over to the Silverberg Kala. I want to be, and who goes to daven by the Mama Leah? Who goes, how many people go to Mersa? Everybody goes to Mama Rachel. So I want to be like Rachel Ameinu, I want to be a Mavater. The parents saw she was very serious. They said, you know what, if it really means that much to you, fine, we'll give in. And that's what happens. The day of the wedding, you won't believe this. It's 1 o'clock in New York, and it's 7 o'clock in Eretz Yisrael, the time difference, and the wedding is starting, and the caterer gets a call from somebody in New York who says, I'm going right now to marry off my youngest daughter. We're going for pictures. My wife and I are so grateful that we're able to do it in a comfortable way. We want to pay for a wedding in Yerushalayim. And we know you have 2 wedding halls. And we know that Ulam Beis is smaller than Ulam Aleph. So probably the family in Ulam Beis tonight needs it more than the family in Ulam Aleph. So we want to pay for the entire wedding of the family that's in Ulam Beis. And they paid for the caterer, the flowers, and the photographer. How does such an unbelievable thing happen? You know why? Because the Eibush just saw my tochterol, my daughter, you're such a balas midas, you're such a mavater, I'll take care of you. And that's why her whole